Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again. Today I'm reviewing Confessions of an English Opium-Eater by Thomas de Quincey. In his introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of the book, Barry Milligan remarks on the fact that this is one of those books that everybody knows. I believe that most people who have an interest in literature or who are, I would say, cultured enough in general probably have an awareness of the Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, of Thomas de Quincey's figure as an artist, figures as a thinker, as a scandalous thinker from the early 19th century, who scandalized British society with his reports on his years of opium addiction that he was heroically able to survive and overcome, except he never really was. But at the same time, while the novel itself and its reputations are pretty large, very few people these days read Thomas de Quincey. I myself, I must confess, would never have read the Confessions. I don't think so, at least, if they hadn't been explicitly recommended to me by my PhD supervisor because of their relation with my brother's topic of research, which is escapism and artists escaping into the imagination as a way of retreating away from life, from traumatic events, from the difficulties of everyday life or of large historical events. And the Confessions is indeed about retreating away from life in the world of opium and in the world of drugs. The Confessions is about drugs, 100%. It's about opium, more specifically it's mostly about laudanum. I will leave it again to Barry Milligan's introduction to talk about all this once you pick up the book and once you check it out. Small aside, I absolutely recommend the Penguin Classics edition of the book. The notes are highly informative and allow you to get the most out of the book. They explain away some of the most obscure references to contemporary readers, but they never get into the way of the narration. Highly recommended. The book is about drugs, and Thomas de Quincey was in a way a founding figure, a forerunner of drug culture. He took opium to enjoy live music, the way people would do at Woodstock and, well, most other concerts in the late 20th century. He discussed certain topics like the symptoms and the consequences of withdrawal, or the fact that drug addicts over time build a certain resistance threshold, which means that they have to take greater and greater quantities of their drug to get the same results from them. He discussed these topics in a historical time where they weren't part of the scientific debate at all, in a time where the scientific community's opinion on opium in general was far from uniform and unanimous. It is, in that sense, a pretty valuable historical document and an example of how a thinker, a writer, can influence scientific debate more broadly on the way the two cultures, the humanist culture and the scientific culture, have influenced one another historically, have mingled with one another in ways that have become relatively rare these days. The split between the two cultures has grown, the gap between them, the rift between them has grown pretty large, and that is an immense pity and one of the great tragedies, I would say, of academic culture these days. What I was trying to point to is that, sure, this is a book about drugs, but more broadly speaking, I would say it's a book about addiction. I believe that many of the topics discussed here, many of the dynamics of de Quincey's life in his supposed autobiography will be relevant to anyone who's ever been addicted to anything. And it doesn't have to be a drug, it doesn't even have to be a chemical substance in general. The Confessions are written from a point in de Quincey's future where he has given up his addiction to opium, although once more that's kind of a construct. He never really gave up opium in his life, and on that front the novel is also a pretty interesting study in the autobiography as a literary genre, in the distinction, if there really is one, between novel, or at least between the fictional form, and the supposedly memoir/narrative non-fictional form. But at the same time, while it is definitely written from a perspective where, say, the narrator has given up opium, it still speaks of opium as some kind of dream substance. The narrator still reels thinking about he has dreams, thinking about his happiness through the use of opium, and you still perceive that kind of longing and the sick mechanism that drove the Quincey to this escape drug time and again in the course of his life. I definitely see why it scandalized people when it came out, because it requires an especially intelligent reader to appreciate a novel such as this, and I hope I'm not just patting my own back right now. Who knows if I actually got it, but I believe it requires a certain form of emotional intelligence to understand that the author is not necessarily condoning relying on chemical substances to escape pain, but at the same time is unable to hide how that was possibly his only solution at a certain time in his life. The Confessions, probably its greatest achievement, is being a testimony to the way humans react to certain moments of absolute misery. There are certain passages in here about the Quincey's year of absolute poverty as a young man, basically as an adolescent in 19th century London, that are heartbreaking. Even if you care nothing about addiction, about these topics, reading about the Quincey's pure and beautiful friendship with a prostitute named Anne in London, when both of them had absolutely nothing in the world, but they still looked out for one another. That's one of the most moving passages I've read in recent years. In that sense, the Confessions are a beautiful document to the evolution of the romantic sensibility. The Quincey definitely was one of the romantics, maybe not one of the great famous romantics, British romantics everybody knows. He wasn't one of the big six, but he still was part of that movement. He still argued for a way of living and a way of thinking about the world that belonged absolutely to that current and that has seeped throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, into our broader culture. In a similar way as the 1960s, say, might have passed, but the Cultural Revolution has seeped into our broader culture, whether we like it or not. Speaking of the 60s and of 20th century drug culture more generally speaking, this is a beautiful document to read alongside narratives about that other period where drugs played an important part on the evolution of certain subcultures. In particular, I think this is a great book to read alongside Naked Lunch, which I can now not extract from my bookshelf. Alongside William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, which I recently read, and which also testifies to the horrible state and to the nightmarish visions that somebody who is hooked, who is chained to a chemical substance, has to endure. And it is a document, although a pretty divisive one. In the comments to my review of Naked Lunch, half of the people absolutely venerate the novel and half of the people despise it greatly. They're both nightmarish documents. They are in very different ways, and I'm sure there is somebody who is more into the science of addiction than I am will probably argue of the different ways opium and heroin act on the brain. Burroughs himself does that in several of his essays, and if you do read Naked Lunch, also choose the Penguin Classics edition, whose supplementary essays are absolutely fundamental to an appreciation of the novel. Where am I going with this? Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, beautiful document on the dynamics of addiction and on the dynamics of human suffering and what humans do to avoid it, what humans do to fight it and carry on living. Have you read the Confessions? Do you agree with my assessment that it's a pretty famous narrative, but not one that's very widely read in today's world? I look forward to discussing it in the comment section below. Thank you as always for watching the review. Bye guys.